I looked around me and realized we were no longer before the chambers with bars, and I no longer held the key. We were in a tunnel of sorts, and I had the sensation of moving at great speed. I discerned that the tunnel was alive. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say it was a part of my being. It was mine, and I had created it. My escort smiled again. That is right. It is a portal. Hello, and welcome back to WordWise. I'm your host, Kit, and tonight I'll be continuing our deep dive into Lori Daybell's favorite book, Visions of Glory. If you haven't seen my first two videos about this book, I strongly recommend watching those first, as there's a lot going on here. They are in a playlist titled Visions of Glory. But I'll give a brief recap now, since it's been a few months since I put out a video about this book. Visions of Glory purports to be the near-death experiences, plural, of a man named Spencer, whom we now know is really a therapist named Tom Harrison. Tom Harrison recounted his experiences to a writer named John Pontius, who turned them into a book that was published shortly before Pontius died of cancer. Because I don't know which parts of the story came from Tom Harrison and which parts came from John Pontius, I simply refer to them as the author. The story narrates Spencer's multiple near-death experiences, although whether or not he actually came anywhere near death is a major question, and one that's going to become more confusing in the segment I'm discussing tonight. During Spencer's first near-death experience, he went into anaphylactic shock in response to IV contrast, left his body, and wandered around the hospital in astral form. He discovered that he could communicate telepathically with everything, and a couch gave him some really juicy gossip about the hospital staff. His second NDE was caused by getting really tired while flying to Tahiti, and he had a very racist vision of the ancient Tahitians, and then claimed to have predicted the death of the LDS prophet. After that, Spencer had a vision of Jesus, who looks just like Thor in the Marvel movies. We also examined how Spencer's undisclosed diagnosis of myalgic encephalomyelitis changes our understanding of his medical problems, and considered the lessons regarding suffering and obedience as a gateway to heaven that are taught in LDS scripture, Doctrine and Covenants. I had a really hard time preparing for this video because I reached a point in the book when I could no longer suspend my disbelief. To my credit, I made it about 70 pages in before I lost the ability to think of this story as anything other than preposterous. But if this is a book you dearly love and feel contains deep spiritual wisdom, this probably isn't the video for you. I have no desire to hurt people's feelings, so I'm putting that out there now. Abandon all hope, ye who entered this portal. Let's begin. Chapter 4, Deepening Trials. The chapter opens with a brief paragraph explaining that, oh yeah, Spencer has had 4 or 5 more visions or incidents where he's visited by angels, all of which occurred while he was struggling with insomnia, which I'm sure is a total coincidence and not evidence that he was dreaming. For reasons unknown, we don't get to hear anything about the contents of these visions. The author explains that after the vision of hugging Jesus in the church parking lot, Spencer's health continues to worsen, but the only specific issues mentioned are pain with my teeth and sinuses. As someone who often sounds like a frog in her videos due to allergies and asthma, I sympathize, but I'm also a little confused as to the conclusion Spencer draws from this. The visions I had seen never departed from my thinking, especially when I grew quite ill. The next few years were full of fear and uncertainty. I completely, powerfully believed the things that I had seen, but I also believed I had to be alive to accomplish them. The fear and uncertainty arose from the growing sense that I was never going to recover and would die having not accomplished my life's work. Spencer is convinced he's going to die from his sinus infection, which is technically possible, although pretty rare in this day and age, and he's upset because he knows he hasn't completed his life's mission. Now, so far we haven't heard what his life's mission is supposed to be. If that was told to him during one of the near-death experiences, the author left it out. Or maybe it was something he learned while lying in bed at night with his eyes shut, talking to angelic visitors, but certainly not asleep. It was about this time that I was released as a counselor in the bishopric due to my illness. I was simply not able to complete my calling as I wanted and as the bishop needed. I asked to be released, but it was a difficult and emotionally damaging decision because it seemed to confirm my fears that I was not going to be able to do the things I had seen in vision. Interesting. We heard in an earlier chapter about Spencer's desire to work his way up the priesthood, as the author put it. I wonder if he considered being a counselor as a stepping stone to becoming a bishop. Despite the author's insistence that Spencer only cares about fulfilling the mission God has given him for his life, it's hard not to see little hints that his motives were at least partly rooted in personal ambition. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, only that I think it's disingenuous for the author to claim that Spencer has changed his life from egocentric to Christ-centric, which he literally did in a previous chapter. If what he really wants is to submit and suffer so he can be purified, why does he care about being a counselor? Shouldn't he be laying in bed in agony thinking, "Oh, it feels so good to suffer. I'm beating Satan at his own game." My life became a round of trying to rest enough to work a few hours, then going back to bed, then struggling to work a little more. I was pretty sure that my life was about over, and I admit I was scared. I was convinced my problem was with my heart, but every doctor I went to found something new to diagnose. I became so ill that I really believed this was the end of my life. I was just going to slowly get worse and worse until I passed away. According to Tom Harrison's second talk at the Bateman Horn Center, 20 years passed between his diagnosis with ME and his return to work. That means he didn't start working again until 2009. But this event in the narrative takes place significantly before that, which we know because Neil A. Maxwell comes to visit on the next page, and he died in 2004. The only conclusion I can draw is that either Tom Harrison lied in his talk or the author is lying here, because these timelines don't gel. And why is Spencer convinced he has a heart problem? We know he had a heart valve issue previously, but the only other specific health problem mentioned in this part of the book are his tooth pain and sinus infection. One of the major shortcomings of this book is that it leaves so much out. I can think of a dozen reasons the author left out Spencer's ME diagnosis, but it's hard to guess what belongs in some of these other blank spots. What was Spencer experiencing that was making him believe he was about to die? Elder Maxwell comes to visit him and says, "Spencer, you need to learn to be content with what the Lord has allotted you." The author admits that isn't what Spencer wants to hear, which is understandable. Nobody who's confined to bed wants to hear that their prayers to be well enough to get out of bed are unreasonable. For years, Gosha told me that I needed to learn how to rest, and I spit the bit every time he said it. Don't tell him he was right. Spencer develops an infection in his jawbone and orbital socket, and it's going to require major surgery to treat. My infected jawbone and sinus cavity needed to be removed. He said parts of my jaw and facial bone would have to be replaced by titanium plates. He said I would lose all of my teeth in my upper left jaw and that I needed the surgery immediately. It was hard news to hear. My wife and I wept and talked about what to do for many hours. Yeah, that sounds like terrible news. Absolutely miserable. I don't want any part of my skull replaced with titanium. I got 3 other opinions, which only confirmed the first doctor's diagnosis. At the same time, my cardiologist and regular physician both believed I would not survive the surgery. My whole team of doctors concluded that I should just go home and prepare to die. Yeah, so I have a hard time buying this. A whole team of doctors decided to tell a 50-year-old man with at least 5 children to go home and die instead of trying IV antibiotics? I don't know, I'm not a doctor, but this seems a little far-fetched. And it only gets crazier from here. Spencer knows a random lawyer who knows a guy named Jason who recovered from a cancer similar to Spencer's, because now suddenly it's not a bone infection, it's bone cancer. And Jason knows a German doctor practicing in Mexico who's replacing diseased bones with sea coral instead of titanium. Jason offers to pay for everything, so Spencer flies to Mexico for surgery 3 different times and gets his facial bones replaced with coral. My intention when I sat down to talk about this book wasn't to figure out whether or not all of this really happened, and it isn't even my primary interest. But I think I would be remiss if I didn't say that, like Spencer's infant body being wrapped in newspaper and chucked in a sink, I don't think this happened. It's too many far-fetched things all thrown together. A rare cancer, a mysterious benefactor, a German doctor running a clinic in Mexico, multiple facial surgeries that don't appear to have left scars. It's like the origin story of a Bond villain. And while trying to look into some of this, I happened to stumble on a Deseret News article saying that sea coral was already being used in bone grafts in Utah in 1997. Why couldn't Jason pay for Spencer to get the surgery in Salt Lake? Why add the risk of international travel? If someone wrote this story on Reddit, it would get downvoted to oblivion. I may be wrong. Maybe this actually happened to Tom Harrison. Maybe Herr Doctor went in through the roof of his mouth when he replaced Spencer's eye socket, and that's why there's no scar. But the thing I can't believe is that no one put Spencer on antibiotics after this surgery. Even though he claims to have heart trouble and to have had rheumatic fever twice. People who've had rheumatic fever always have to take antibiotics when they get oral surgery because they're at increased risk of developing a heart infection. Which is exactly what happens. Spencer gets infective endocarditis once he's back home, so his doctor gives him oral antibiotics and sends him home because he's afraid Spencer will catch another infection if he's hospitalized. At this point, I would put down money that this didn't happen. Not just because these medical details make very little sense, but because of how they make no sense. All my writer senses are tingling, and they're pointing out that all of these strange story elements seem designed to accomplish the same thing. They all seem expressly chosen to make the story impossible to verify or disprove. Let's say you're a reporter and you're investigating the validity of this book. You ask Tom Harrison for medical records. He hands you an X-ray with a dark spot on it, which is what the book's author claims happened. A dark spot could be any number of things. A cyst, a bone infection. I once got incorrectly diagnosed with a stroke because an MRI beam bounced off some dental hardware in my mouth. Maybe Spencer had a wonky filling. There are no medical records saying cancer because it was incorrectly diagnosed as a bone infection, even though a total of 4 doctors came to that conclusion. There are no financial or insurance records because this mysterious guy Jason, whom Spencer never even met until years after the surgery, kindly swooped in to pay for everything. There are no medical records of the infective endocarditis because Spencer's doctor had never heard of the ICU and sent him home instead. And Spencer doesn't set off airport alarms with his partially titanium skull because he got his new face made out of sea coral. It's just all very convenient, isn't it? Call me a cynic, but I'm not buying it. There is also a more obvious error in this book that I want to point out. It starts on page 70. The second surgery was the most complicated and lasted 8 hours. They removed my cancerous sinus and upper jaw and placed pulverized sea coral into its place. Even so, I returned home 3 days after the surgery. This seems to say quite clearly that he went home after the second surgery. 2 days later, he decides to give a lecture because he's desperate for money, and he collapses in the middle of the lecture. At this point, I've given up trying to figure out the timeline of him working versus not working. All I know is that this collapse and subsequent diagnosis with endocarditis occurred 5 days after the second surgery. Of all the illnesses I have ever had, this was the worst. Every moment I felt closer to death. Because of the extreme suffering of my body, and because I was still dealing with all of the post-operative recovery from the 3 surgeries in Mexico, these were dark days of pain and suffering indeed. Wait, when did he have this 3rd surgery? I want to give John Pontius the benefit of the doubt here. Maybe it's a typo. Maybe Pontius was dealing with cancer and chemo brain and he was tired. Personally, I think Tom Harrison couldn't keep his lies straight and Pontius didn't catch this one. I have no factual evidence for that. It's a theory that I hold based on having caught Tom Harrison in other lies. Or not even lies. I call them fudgings in my mind. They're little lies. Baby lies. The sort of lie you could easily dismiss if it weren't the 14th one. But the more I look, the more I find. And it feels less like carelessness than it does evidence of fundamental dishonesty. That's my take. I found myself daily and nightly having experiences with the other side. Spirits came into my home and stood by my bed. I was in and out of consciousness. I was so weak that I didn't try to talk to them. I just watched them. They came 2 or 3 times a day and often during the night. In all candor, my doctor should have put me in the hospital because I was dying. Every moment was agony, and every moment I felt a little worse. My strength was completely gone, and I lost all will to live. I think this is at least the 5th time Spencer has claimed to be dying. And as usual, his wife Lynn isn't concerned. She's lying next to Spencer, fast asleep one night, when a strange young woman walks into their bedroom. Her hair was long and dark, almost black. It was thick and slightly wavy. It extended to below her shoulders. It was not tied in any way, but fell freely on her shoulders. She had a beautiful face with high cheekbones. She had the most beautiful, penetrating eyes I have ever seen. They were brown with turquoise streaks in them. I know that sounds unusual, but that's what I saw. I don't know why we needed 4 sentences about her hair. Also, aside from the eyes, doesn't she look a lot like Jesus? Shoulder-length dark hair, high cheekbones, penetrating eyes. Is this person Girl Jesus? I'm gonna call her that, because the author never gives her a name. Then we get 2 rather long paragraphs about her outfit, which boil down to cream-colored dress. I'm theorizing that this detailed description was included because there seems to be a lot of curiosity about what angels and dead people wear. Dwayne Crowther has a whole section on clothing in near-death experiences in one of the books on the shelves behind me. The clothing pretty much always looks like this. It's white. It's flowy. It's usually described as a robe, though, not a dress. But there isn't a whole lot of difference. Without speaking verbally, I heard her voice in my mind. Do I have your permission to do what I have been sent here to do? I'm not really sure it counts as asking permission if you won't tell the person what you're asking permission to do. But Spencer feels a warmth on his bosom, so he knows Girl Jesus is there to bless him. Also, all of his pain has miraculously vanished. When my mind actually caught up with me, I began to wonder, why would God send a woman to me this time? My question wasn't about her ability. It was just that all of my previous angelic visitors and guides had been men. I told myself to shut up. Quit questioning, and just enjoy this experience as long as it lasts. I can think of half a dozen ways the author could have phrased that didn't sound as suggestive as this one. My guess is that the author sent in Girl Jesus instead of one of Spencer's male ancestor angels because Girl Jesus and Spencer are about to get sort of physical, and he didn't want to risk anything that could look like gayness. Although I'm not clear on why she needs to do to Spencer what she's about to do. She rose up into the air and positioned herself horizontally over my body. She never touched me, even though her face was no more than a foot away from mine. She was close enough that I could see the small veins and pores of her skin. As others have noted, this image appears to be straight out of Ghostbusters, although the author specifies that Girl Jesus' dress and hair don't respond to gravity and remain in place. But the author also specifies that Girl Jesus is so close to Spencer that she's nearly touching him, and it's impossible not to see this as Esule. She's basically on top of him. Also, the scene in the movie that this appears to be referencing is explicitly Esule. Dana, while possessed by Zul's gatekeeper, is trying to seduce Venkman. And what is this angel doing that she needs to be hovering horizontally over Spencer? She's helping him remember his NDEs. What I had remembered most clearly from those experiences was what my five senses had recorded. She was allowing or enabling me to see them again from the eternal perspective I had once had when I first experienced them. I had not forgotten those events, but had shifted my understanding in the last 26 years to accommodate what I thought was my impending death. She was not only allowing me to recall the events, but to understand once again the deeper meanings within them, and that their promises and prophecy were still true. I don't know why she needed to be lying on top of him in order to assist in this manner, but that's what she did. Also, I want to point out that this claim that 26 years have passed since Spencer's first NDE puts this event in 2009. So either at least 5 years have passed since Neil A. Maxwell told Spencer to be content with the Lord's plan for him, or else the apostle who told him that wasn't Neil A. Maxwell. I don't know which. The author is going to mention in the next excerpt that Girl Jesus appeared just a few days after the visit from the apostle, which makes no sense. The constant contradictions in the timeline are part of why I'm suspicious that this book is mostly fiction. I had been playing this message in my mind over and over. I am dying. Soon. I was troubled that my life was about over, and my mission, as I had seen it in vision, had not yet happened. I learned from this beautiful, unnamed angel that I still had many things to do, and all that I had seen before was written by God into my mortal journey. All of it would happen. This was her message to me. You are not going to die at this time. She literally commanded me to stop thinking of myself as if I were dying. She stayed in that position, hovering over me, for an indefinite length of time. It might have been seconds or hours. I just don't know. It was also the same message my apostle friend had tried to convey a few days before. This part had me tearing my hair out. Tom Harrison claims to have been trained in cognitive therapy, but a person repeating to themselves, "I'm going to die," over and over, is exactly the sort of unhelpful rumination that cognitive therapy teaches you to avoid. More and more, I get the impression that Tom Harrison doesn't actually believe in psychotherapy or its practices. He's incredibly anti-psychiatry on his podcast, and the author of this book says repeatedly that only Jesus can heal people. It kind of feels like Harrison became a therapist so he could use psychotherapy practice as a cover for doing fringe religious stuff with his clients. What's certain is that he isn't using any of his training to address his own issues. I'm not proud to admit that I did not have significant faith at that time to believe in the visions God had shown me, rather than believing my body, which I thought was quite obviously dying. It is hard, maybe inhumanly hard, to feel your body dying, shutting down, life draining out of you, and still have faith in long-ago promises of a seemingly now impossible future. But I should have. I should have just believed and rejected my body's attempts to die. Then my faith in God and my Savior would have raised me up. I am certain of that. This take is based on so many unhealthy, unrealistic assumptions. People of strong faith die. Death isn't a failure, and having faith won't allow you to live forever. The author is essentially arguing that Spencer should have had faith strong enough to counter reality. That's not faith. That's insanity. Girl Jesus promises Spencer that everything he saw in his vision that we'd never heard about will really come to pass, and then she takes off. And I'm just gonna say it. Spencer had sex with the angel. It's obvious that he had sex with I can't say that. That's disrespectful to Jesus. We'll just call the angel Jen. Spencer cheated on his wife with Jen, and I can't figure out why the text goes to such lengths to say that without saying it. If Tom Harrison told John Pontius that he had sex with an angel, why did he tell Pontius not to include that part? And then Pontius decided to imply it anyway. Did Tom Harrison want to include it? And Pontius said, hey, we can probably avoid saying it outright? Did Pontius add all this sexual innuendo? The next morning, Spencer wakes up thinking, I'm cured. But it turns out he's every bit as sick as he was before. However, the promise that his visions will come to pass changes his attitude and he begins to recover. Then he makes the mistake of telling his wife Lynn about his midnight visitor. I was excited when I told my wife about the experiences of the night before. She did not receive it well, neither the message nor how it was delivered. I can only imagine poor Lynn saying, what do you mean she hovered over you horizontally in bed? Why was that necessary? I think it's so accidentally telling that the author says she didn't like how the message was delivered. I don't think she meant Girl Jesus' tone of voice. But then it gets strange, because it turns out that Lynn is upset that Spencer is going to live. What I had forgotten, as deathly ill people do, was that she was suffering right along with me. I wasn't dying alone. I was taking a piece of her heart and her love and her peace with me. She had accepted the inevitability of my death and had actually been expecting it that very night. I've never experienced the death of someone I lived with and took care of, so maybe this is more realistic than it sounds like, but it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine that she was expecting that he might die that night and just went to sleep beside him like it was any other night. The author says that eventually Lynn got over herself and rejoiced that Spencer was going to live. Thus ends Chapter 4. Chapter 5, Caves, Keys, and Callings. This chapter begins a week later, when Spencer wakes up with a premonition that he's going to have 3 visitors that day, Ebenezer Scrooge style. The author even admits that this is just like A Christmas Carol, which seems like a strange reference to bring into a story about NDEs and the end of the world, but that's the choice the author made. The first 2 visitors are boring old humans, but that night, Spencer hears someone knocking on the front door, but his wife doesn't hear it. In fact, she thinks he's hallucinating, so she just goes to sleep. Really, nothing can get this woman's concern up, can it? Although I think that Lynn's lack of reaction to Spencer's weird experiences throughout this book are indicative that she didn't find his experiences very credible, I also think the author is deliberately implying that Lynn isn't spiritually advanced compared to Spencer. And I can't help thinking of Chad and Lori. Both of them were reported to have felt that their spouses, prior to each other, of course, were spiritually inferior to them. I bet they would have identified with Spencer here, because he certainly doesn't seem to like Lynn very much. Spencer lies in bed and listens to this ongoing knocking. It begins at the front door and then moves to the bedroom door, but he still doesn't seem concerned that someone has let themselves into his house. I finally began to realize that it might be an angel coming to take me from mortality. This was the ongoing war between my understanding of my physical condition and what the beautiful angel had so powerfully taught me, that I was not going to die. Up until now, my faith had been stronger than my thinking, but on this particular night, I found myself once again wavering. I chided myself and anchored my faith once again. There's a pattern in this book in which Spencer has a life-altering spiritual experience, but then it turns out not to have changed anything. It's frustrating because it prevents the plot from progressing. Nothing ever actually happens. He always thinks something important and faith-affirming has happened, but then his life doesn't change, so his faith backslides. And then the cycle repeats. Finally, Spencer leaves his body. It isn't really clear why or how. It just happens. I guess that knocking was really getting on his nerves. The author specifies that Spencer looks back and sees that his body has stopped breathing. I tried to open the door and could not. My hand passed through the doorknob, so I walked through it. I found myself facing a pleasant-looking male angel. He was an angel of light and had the full brightness of the other angels I had seen who had come to minister to the newly dead. But the instant I looked upon him, I knew that he had not come to take me from the earth. He was not the Grim Reaper, so to speak. He had been my guide on several other out-of-body experiences, so I recognized him even though I didn't know his name. Isn't it interesting that we got a detailed, multi-paragraph description of Jen, but we don't hear anything about the appearance of this male angel other than pleasant-faced and bright? I think it's notable that the author says Spencer has had other out-of-body experiences. These seem to be distinct from his NDEs, but we only get to hear about them in passing. I'm not sure why the author didn't write more about them, given that this is a book about spiritual experiences. Maybe he just felt like the book was already long enough. Or maybe he wanted to leave himself a little wiggle room in the plot in case things didn't add up later. The angel spoke to me verbally, not to my spirit as in other instances. He had a body and was not a spirit. I realized that I, now in my spirit self, was less substantial than he was. Okay, this confused me. The angel is in a physical body, but he can still see Spencer's spirit and hear it talk and even touch it, as he's going to do shortly? Thank you to Nadine, who kindly sent me an email explaining the LDS concepts of angels and demons. If I understand correctly, this angel is actually a resurrected being, which would account for his having a physical body. I'm still not sure how he's able to physically interact with Spencer's spirit body, but maybe that's a special power angels have? Spencer and the angel walk, arm in arm, down Spencer's street, and then the scene around them changes, and they're standing in front of a mountain. I did not know where the vision was taking me. I was given to understand that I was now looking into the future at what the purpose of my life would be. I concluded that I was seeing a type or metaphor of the purpose of my life, not actual events that would happen just the way I was seeing them. But I also understood that the mission being suggested by this metaphor would actually happen, if not exactly as I was seeing it now. Once again, we get the caveat that this isn't a prediction of the future, it's just a prediction of the spiritual purpose of future events. Sounds like a distinction without much of a difference to me. While standing in front of the mountain, the angel asks Spencer what he sees. I walked closer. There were lights high up on the mountainside. Finally, I realized they were coming from the mouths of 4 big man-made caverns. The caverns were about 12 feet tall and about 150 feet wide at their opening. The openings had bars on them, as if they were prisons. The caves extended deep into the mountain, with doors leading beyond what I could see. Spencer and the angel are magically transported closer to the cells built into the mountainside, and Spencer realizes that the locks on the bars are on the inside, that these people have locked themselves in. Spencer asks why they've done so, and the angel explains. These individuals have locked themselves away because of the persecution and mistreatment that they have endured from religious organizations and from the mistreatment of governments and the authority of the world. A little far-fetched, but possible. There was actually a case like this in the USSR, the Lykov family. They fled religious persecution and lived in horrendous conditions in the Siberian wilderness for decades. Not a happy story. Spencer asks why he's being shown these people who've locked themselves into a mountain, and the angel says, "Only individuals like you, who have been willing to undergo similar pain and mistreatment as these people have, will they ever listen to and trust? You must continue to drink of this bitter cup and not become bitter yourself. This will give you the experience and knowledge you need so that when you are called to work with these people, they will trust you and recognize in you that you are a fellow sufferer and refugee from persecution. These sufferings and your personal triumph over them will be written on your very soul and into the sinews of your body, and they will recognize it and trust you. Then he said something that I have pondered for years. He added, "They will see that you also belong to the fellowship of the suffering of Christ." What the angel appears to be saying is that someday in the future, Spencer is going to be an ambassador to these isolated people, and they'll allow him to work with them because they'll recognize that he's been subjected to the same type of persecution that they have. The thing is, at no point in this book has Spencer been persecuted for anything. He's had health problems and disappointments and bad luck, but no one has persecuted him. My guess is that this passage is alluding to being Mormon. Although decades and decades have passed since the LDS people were subjected to real persecution at the hands of the government, it still looms large in Mormon cultural memory. Spencer is acting as a sort of stand-in for the LDS people as a whole here. He's having this vision in which he's being told that his suffering has prepared him for a great future, and this reference to persecution is almost telling Mormondom at large the same thing. Your suffering has a holy purpose. This last line about how Spencer is a member of the fellowship of the suffering of Christ is very important. It's taken from Philippians 3:10, 3:11. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the sharing of his sufferings by becoming like him in his death, if somehow I may attain the resurrection from the dead. The King James Version and many other versions of the Bible actually use the phrase, the fellowship of his sufferings, but I stick to the New Revised Standard Edition because it's the most accurate translation. Even in the KJV, though, it's clear that the fellowship of the suffering of Jesus is metaphorical. It's not a real fellowship, like the Fellowship of the Ring. The author of this book, however, treats it as a real fellowship, with members and an initiation, and much of this chapter is obliquely going to describe Spencer joining it. A female angel, not Spencer's ex, appears and gives Spencer a foot-long key, and we then sit through 4 pages of descriptions and explanations about this key, which ought to tell you how important the author feels the key is. I tried to draw it for you because it's unusual, and I didn't want to read all 4 pages, but the description is somewhat contradictory. The key was about a foot long, shaped like a modern key, with a rounded handle and a shank with saw-like ridges on it and grooves along the side. It was heavy, as if made from solid metal, which looked and hefted like solid gold. The feel of the metal was soft, like velvet, not hard like gold. The handle was about 6 inches across, with precious gems infused into the metal. It appeared as if the jewels had been cast into the metal, because I could not feel them on the smooth surface of the key. But each stone was clearly visible and sparkling within the metal, as if the metal were transparent over the stones. Each gem seemed to have a tiny light source within it, which made the key sparkle like glitter with light that came from within the key rather than as a reflection of the sun. I take back every nice thing I've ever said about John Pontius's writing. It looked like gold, but it wasn't like gold, and it feels like solid metal, but it's also soft like velvet, and it has gemstones infused or maybe cast into the metal, and the metal is partially transparent? How can it be all of those things simultaneously? The author also says that it looks millions of years old, but it isn't scratched or worn at all. So what makes it look old? Oh, and it has symbols on it. But the author didn't say what kind of symbols, only that Spencer understood their meaning telepathically, but we never learned what they meant. So I just did my own thing and added some Elder Futhark runes. I also couldn't figure out how to make the key beautiful, which the text says it was. You'll have to imagine that part. The key itself represented a mission to rescue the people whom I could see on the other side of the bars. The key represented the ability to unlock the bars that kept them in their self-imposed prison. Okay, that makes sense symbolically, except that the people locked themselves in, which would suggest they have their own keys. But the key, while the author has made it very literal, is supposed to be a symbol of Spencer's God-given mission to bring these people out of the mountains and into Zion. The key is divided into colored segments. The blood-red shank stands for sacrifice. In order to receive the key, and the assignment it represented, one had to be prepared by sacrificing their will, their earthly possessions, their health if called upon, or even their lives if need be, to follow the path God ordained to prepare that person with charity, faith, doctrinal purity, sound understanding, and most of all, perfect obedience to God's will. This is the course Christ had submitted himself to, though his suffering was far greater and for all mankind. It occurred to me as I was reading this that part of the appeal of this book to a lot of people is how extreme it is. That shouldn't surprise me because religious zealots are as old as the hills, but I feel like all these doomsday preppers should toss their copies of Visions of Glory and pick up After the Ecstasy, the Laundry instead. They won't, of course, because they crave excitement and feeling special and the thrill of Armageddon. I find the excerpt very unsettling, because what it's really saying is that we have to obliterate ourselves in order to serve God. And while LDS theology emphasizes the importance of agency, this book talks like even considering for an instant whether or not to do what God has asked means you aren't faithful enough. Pausing to think things through before acting doesn't mean you lack faith. If anything, it means you're sensible enough to be on the lookout for false prophets. I was given to understand that there was no other way and no other path to this type of service. It was a path that could require the shedding of blood and sacrifices of similar magnitude. When a servant of God followed this path to its end, it left a recognizable mark upon the servant, a glow, if you will, of righteousness. This is why I feel this book is dangerous. We shouldn't be celebrating books that tell us that not only is bloodshed acceptable, it's the only way to God. It's the only way to be holy in God's sight. If you're enough of an immature drama queen to actually believe that, then maybe ending your children's lives seems justified and reasonable. The blue handle represented the royal bloodline, which I immediately knew was the latter-day priesthood. We also have heard it called the Holy Priesthood after the Order of the Son of God. Who is we? We also have heard it called. Unless it's a typo, the only explanation I can think of is that it refers to Tom Harrison and John Pontius. We know that Pontius felt so strongly about Tom Harrison and his so-called visions that he spent the last year of his life writing this book. Did Tom Harrison somehow involve Pontius in these visions, or convince him he could have one of his own visions, Second Comforter style? I don't know. I want to clarify that the Holy Priesthood after the Order of the Son of God refers to the Melchizedek priesthood. As for the royal bloodline, I'm not certain what the author means, but the LDS Church teaches that all its members are either literally or spiritually descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. That might be what this means. My gut is telling me that it's referencing something darker and grosser, but I don't have evidence of that. At least not yet. The author continues to explain what this key symbolizes, and I'm going to read through it line by line, because I think this is the heart of the book's secret message. The blue represented three things. First, the receipt and righteous magnification of the present priesthood. The word present is really significant here. Saying that the Melchizedek priesthood is the present priesthood implies that there's going to be a new priesthood in the future. And this isn't entirely without theological precedent. Joseph Smith did imply several times that new ordinances were going to be revealed after the completion of the Nauvoo temple. He was killed before the temple was completed, so we never found out what those ordinances were. Here, the author is saying that the Melchizedek priesthood will become more prominent in the lives of priesthood holders, but he's also implying that there will be another level or type of priesthood in the future. Second, it represented the receipt of the fullness of that same priesthood when worthiness and the timetable of God called it forth. I'm not certain what the author meant by this. Fullness is a word that's used a bit differently in the LDS world than outside it. According to an article on BYU's website, the fullness of the priesthood is the highest order of the priesthood. Church-sanctioned websites often specify that a temple marriage is the fullness of the priesthood, but outside websites frequently point to a ritual called the second anointing. The second anointing is an ordinance that was fairly widespread in Joseph Smith's day, but after the move to Salt Lake, it was given dramatically less often. Today it's shrouded in secrecy, but a few people, whom I find fairly credible, have come forth to say they received it. These are almost always lifelong, devout, often wealthy church members. The second anointing guarantees entrance to the celestial kingdom after death. It gives you carte blanche to sin as much as you want, because the only sin that can revoke your salvation is denying Christ. It sounds remarkably like Lori Daybell's "doesn't count for me" line. Now, there's basically zero chance that Lori received the second anointing, at least through official channels. But I was on Web Sleuths a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about people Chad and Lori hung out with. And Meek and Connor said that Lori had been given an ordination to a higher priesthood by Jason Mao. Don't worry, I'm going to talk about his wildly overwritten young adult novels at some point. But right now, I'm wondering if Mao ordained her to some parody of the second anointing, and that's why she thinks she's translated. That's 99% speculation, but it would explain some things. What's notable about the author's statement that worthiness and the timetable of God called it forth is that it implies that the current Melchizedek priesthood is incomplete, that not all of its blessings and ordinances currently exist in the world, and that God will add to what's available in the future. From what I've read, this is in keeping with LDS teachings, but why bring it up now when talking about the key? The author is about to explain. Third, it represented a foreordination to this very mission to release these people. Only that specifically ordained officer of the priesthood could manipulate the key. The handle is how it is gripped and operated. The word ordain appears twice here. That's significant. If we put all of this together, what this passage is saying is that the blue part of the key represents the Melchizedek priesthood, greater blessings and authority associated with the priesthood that God will reveal in the future, and ordination to that degree of authority. Oh, and Spencer is a person who's going to be ordained to that higher level of the priesthood. We know that because of the two rather odd final sentences. Only that specifically ordained officer of the priesthood could manipulate the key. The handle is how it is gripped and operated. The author doesn't say, "And it was me. I was the one who got to use it." But that's the implication of A, Spencer knowing how to use and operate the key, and B, an angel handing it to him. We're being told that Spencer is going to have special elite level powers in the future. The green tip of the key represents the renewal and recreation of life. And it's at this point that the metaphor becomes unavoidably phallic. The emerald green tip represented a renewal and recreation of life. The tip is the business end of the key. It enters the lock first, and it must be perfectly aligned with the lock in order for any other part of the key to operate. The green tip signified the full outcome of the red and the blue, sacrifice and priesthood, which, as described in the oath and covenant of the priesthood, brings about a renewal of the body. This is why the green tip was entitled Renewal and Recreation of Life. This renewal can represent anything from prolonged mortal life to a healing of all disease to being translated, as was John the Beloved and Enoch's city. The author says that this is the end result of sacrifice and priesthood, which makes no sense to me because mixing blue and red is not going to give you emerald green. Nonetheless, the message seems to be that if you make sacrifices, which I'll remind you could require the shedding of blood, as we learned on the last page, and if you receive the fullness of the priesthood, you'll be translated. No wonder this is Laurie's favorite book. I have come to understand that in order to complete my life's mission, I had to receive this key in the ordained way, by becoming a member of the fellowship of the suffering of Christ, and by doing it freely, willingly, even joyfully. I now understand that it is a personal journey of great consequence. It is not a pathway for seekers of comfort and casual service. So it isn't enough to have faith and follow the commandments. If you aren't suffering, you just aren't hardcore enough for edgelord Jesus. Seriously though, that's kind of what the author is saying. That Spencer's suffering is his ordination, and by experiencing it, he's proving himself worthy to operate this key. This key represented the full course and calling of the priesthood. Only with all three of these elements can we claim the blessings and the honor of serving in any great cause. When we do this, we are no longer serving the church, our families, or even ourselves. We are serving Jesus Christ directly, and doing the Father's work of preparing the world for the end of time and the return of Christ. This chapter is just full of alarm bells. This excerpt says that people who accept those callings are no longer working for the church, which I assume means they're no longer beholden to the church's rules. They're no longer working for their families or themselves, which I assume means they're no longer beholden to society's rules. Now the only authority and the only person you have to please is Jesus himself. And who's telling you what Jesus wants? Apparently Spencer. He's the one having visions of Jesus, right? I recently read Chad Daybell's infamous Train Dream for the first time. I might do a short video going through it. If you'd be interested in that, let me know in the comments. Also, I only have the first part of it, the part Chad used as a sort of advertisement for his Avow account. If you got the rest from behind the Avow paywall, please send it to me at wordwisevideos@gmail.com. Essentially, the Train Dream is an unsophisticated metaphor for how church leadership has fallen into apostasy, and the true leaders now are doomsday prepping indie authors like Chad, Julie Rowe, and Hector Souza. The author of Visions of Glory is telling us the same thing. And what does the author tell us this priesthood is intended to accomplish? I was being taught that all of my life I have been engaged in this process of preparing to meet the qualifications and attributes of one who will be handed a key to a portion of the latter-day work of building Zion. In this mighty work, we will free people from their self-imposed prisons, whether real or figurative, and bring them to Zion. Spencer is at least partly in charge of the building of Zion. He's been given the keys to some part of that mission. And given how literal this author is making everything, I assume he's talking literally about building Zion as well. The key did not represent a call to preside or to be a latter-day prophet. It represented the process of acquiring, through the atonement of Christ, the degree of personal purity and sanctification that qualifies the recipient to serve in this great work. It is a work that, as you'll see in future visions I will describe, is fully organized and carried out by the latter-day church. This is not a path that leads outside of the church, or even on a parallel course with the church, but one that brings you into the heart of the ordained mission of the latter-day church to prepare the world for the return of Christ. At first, I thought the author was backtracking a bit by emphasizing that the people he's describing aren't operating outside the church. And I do think there's some of that. But when I reread it, I realized what he's really describing is an elite group within the church that's superior to the rest of the membership. They're at the heart of the ordained mission. The word ordained jumped out at me again here. Now, I'm not LDS, so I do a lot of Googling when I read these books, and I searched ordained mission of the LDS church. The first site that popped up was a page published by the church called Conferring the Priesthood and Ordaining to an Office. And the first paragraph on that page reads, "Performance of this ordinance requires authorization from a priesthood leader who holds the appropriate keys or who functions under the direction of a person who holds those keys." Is it a coincidence that keys appear on both this website and in this chapter of Visions of Glory? I doubt it. Keys carry a great deal of symbolism in LDS theology, which I knew, but I wanted to get a clearer definition, so I did more Googling. By the way, if I haven't said so before, the church's website is amazing. So much information. On a page titled Priesthood Keys, I read, they, meaning keys, control access to the blessings and ordinances of the priesthood. Basically, when you get ordained to a priesthood, that gives you the power to act in God's name to do certain things. But if you hold the keys to the priesthood, that gives you the right to direct other priesthood holders and activities. There are an untold number of keys, each of which correlates to a specific type of blessing or ordinance. So there's one for sealing, there's one for baptism, that kind of thing. So the author is telling us that not only is Spencer going to be ordained to this higher level of the priesthood that's doing the core work of the church, the most important part of the church's mission, but he's also going to be the one in charge of that priesthood. I also find it remarkable and somewhat convenient that this key was conferred on Spencer by an angel, because it would normally be passed from one priesthood holder to the next. Russell M. Nelson wrote, "Joseph Smith conferred those restored priesthood keys upon all of the apostles called in his day. In turn, these keys have been transferred through the generations to the present leaders of the church. Today, the president of the church actively holds every key held by all those who have received a dispensation at any time from the beginning of creation. A sacred moment of my life occurred on April 12, 1984, when the first presidency and members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles laid their hands upon my head. As had been done for others before me, all the keys of the priesthood were conferred. Like each member of the Quorum of the 12, I hold all the keys of the priesthood as restored in these latter days, but some keys are not used unless specifically directed by the senior apostle or upon his death. All of us in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles feel the weight of responsibility and the burden of timeless trust. We know the keys we hold have been restored for the last days and for the last time." As far as I can tell, the last time the priesthood keys were given to someone by an angel, outside the structure of the LDS Church, was when Moses and Elijah appeared and gave them to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery in 1836. That's the level that the author is putting Spencer on. I put everything in the last chapter together, and I came to a conclusion that might, or might not, be obvious to members of the LDS Church. I believe that what the author is talking about isn't the fellowship of the suffering of Christ, as he called it a few pages ago, but the priesthood of the suffering of Christ. He's referencing a secret elite group within the mainstream LDS church of people who have been ordained to a priesthood higher than the Aaronic or the Melchizedek priesthoods. He's saying that Spencer was given the keys to this priesthood, which means Spencer has the authority to direct holders of that priesthood. The author even wrote, this is from an excerpt I read earlier, "I have come to understand that in order to complete my life's mission, I had to receive this key in the ordained way." And he received that key from an angel, independent of church leadership. Jesus bypassed church leadership in order to get Spencer this key to the priesthood, because church leadership is an apostasy, and faithful everyday Mormons who are going through their lives just trying to be good people haven't been sanctified enough through suffering to help Jesus build Zion. I started to think that maybe I was reading too much into this, simply because I couldn't quite believe it was all here. So I got in touch with Redvines. If you don't know her, Redvines is the online handle of an LDS woman who went to high school with Chad and Tammy Daybell. We've appeared on Web Sleuths together a couple of times, and she's fantastic. She was sweet enough to let me call her and ask all my questions. And I want to be clear that she's an active, faithful LDS woman. I'm not going to share personal details, but she's very involved in the church. And she told me that there's no such thing as being ordained through suffering, that all of the priesthood keys that currently exist on earth are in possession of church leadership, and that it's not only heretical, but incredibly egotistical to suggest that an angel gave Spencer a special key. And then the scene just ends, quite abruptly. I looked around me and realized we were no longer before the chambers with bars, and I no longer held the key. We were in a tunnel of sorts, and I had the sensation of moving at great speed. I discerned that the tunnel was alive. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say it was a part of my being. It was mine, and I had created it. My escort smiled again. That is right. It is a portal, and you created it. Only you can use it. The angel then explains that each person spiritually creates their own portal, which connects their home in heaven with the earth and vice versa. And if the tip of the key was undeniably phallic, the description of these portals seems undeniably yonic? That's the closest female equivalent I could find online. I guess we could also try vaginal or birth canal-y. It's a long tunnel you enter in heaven and exit on earth. There's nothing in here about using portals to communicate or being able to open them at will in your closet so that you can cheat on your spouse, but I think that's implied. Now that I think about it, that use of a portal is pretty yonic too, isn't it? And I didn't anticipate how subtly dirty this book would be when I decided to read it. While Spencer and the angel are in the portal tunnel, they talk about all kinds of things, and Spencer gets instant telepathic answers to his questions, none of which he can share with us. My memory of this experience today is that we spoke of many things and that I learned rapidly. I was not allowed to retain in my mortal mind most of what I learned. I'm curious if the reason the author implies throughout this book that there are lots more insights and revelations Spencer learned that he can't share for one reason or another was to leave the door open for a sequel. Spencer asks the angel if the earth itself has a portal, which seems like a very random question to me. Like the kind of question an author has a character ask because they want another character to answer and give the reader information. It doesn't feel natural. The angel explains to Spencer that the earth does just so happen to have its own portal. I then experienced, as if I were actually there, how the earth fell from where it was created and moved to where it is positioned now. I had the impression that it took thousands of years for it to arrive. The image I saw appeared to me to be a folding of the universe. It looked like the universe was folded in on itself, like a sheet of thick paper or fabric, so that where the earth was created and where it was to go were on top of one another. Then the earth was moved from where it emerged and physically transitioned to its new position. I went and read this passage to Gosha because, as it happens, when he did his master's in mathematics, his specialization was mathematical physics. And I wanted to know where this image with the paper came from, because I thought I remembered it from some movie. He pointed out that what the author is describing here is just a wormhole, and that it's appeared in so many sci-fi movies that he described its inclusion here as hackneyed. That's why I can't remember what movie I saw it in. It's in all of them. It's in Stargate, Event Horizon, Star Trek, Star Wars, at least half of the Marvel movies, Interstellar. Pretty much any movie or book or TV show that has a storyline involving faster than light travel has wormholes. The idea itself is presented here as if it's mind-blowingly original, though. Human language does not give us adequate words to describe such things. Nor does human intelligence give us the ability to understand such things unless our minds are open for a moment. While I was with the angel, I could understand all of this clearly. I believe I remember most of what I saw, yet now I have only a fragment of the understanding of what it meant or by what principle it occurred. What I learned then, and what I have been allowed to retain, has taken me many years to acquire the words to describe, even to myself. If you consider that this is the only time I have said many of these things out loud, you will understand why I still struggle for words.
It folds space so that point A and point B coexist in the same space and time. When the spacecraft passes through the gateway.
This is what passes for deep spiritual wisdom in this book. Also, didn't Lori once tell Zulema that she had folded Satan up like a taco? Did this remind anyone else of that? There's more about planes of existence and godly arithmetic and than this. All of the glorified universes I perceived were one of three glories: celestial, terrestrial, or telestial. There were other types, which were not types of glory. These were wonderful places without glory, where beings who had not qualified for a reward of glory during their lifetimes were ultimately sent. These were of every type, of every description, and were created in response to their desires. They wanted nothing more to do with God or his intervention in their lives, so he gave them what they wanted, whatever it was, and there they would stay throughout eternity, unable to challenge God's authority ever again. This really shocked me, because this sounds pretty great. This sounds like exactly what I was taught heaven was in the Catholic and Baptist churches I attended as a kid. If you can have whatever you want, I assume that means you can be with your loved ones and your pets, and it seems like all that's missing is the glory. And despite having looked it up a number of times, I still don't quite understand what glory is in LDS theology. And maybe that's because it's too sublime or high concept for humans to understand. But I feel like this is a very strange passage for this book to include, because what it's saying is that you can ignore God, break all the commandments, be a terrible person, and then get everything you ever wanted. Or spend your life in suffering obedience in order to receive a reward that no one can quite explain. It's like a spiritual version of Let's Make a Deal. Doesn't that message kind of undermine the fundamental premise of the church? Of all churches? Why would I give up coffee and adultery if I can have them and spend eternity in a paradise of my own design? I don't know. Also, I'm not an LDS scholar, but this doesn't comport with any of the LDS theology I've read. If you don't end up in one of the heavens with some degree of glory, don't you go to outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth? I find it so strange that so many faithful LDS people love this book, when what it's teaching clearly isn't in line with what Joseph Smith taught. Then there's this little something that further undermines the text. When a person dies, or when they have an out-of-body experience, as in my case, Their own tunnel brings them back to their original place and to their original structure, which were both spiritual in nature. Did the author just admit that Spencer didn't really have a near-death experience? Or possibly any near-death experiences? He wrote, "When a person dies, or when they have an out-of-body experience, as in my case." It sounds to me like the author is admitting Spencer never really died. The only alternative I can come up with is that he's saying that some of Spencer's experiences were out of body rather than near death. But I feel like John Pontius is a competent enough writer that if that's what he meant to say, that's what he would have said. Spencer and the angel reach the end of the tunnel and find themselves in a meadow. It's common in near-death experience memoirs for the person to pass through the tunnel and discover a beautiful natural setting at the other end. There's a long description of this park-like meadow, the only interesting part of which reads, "There was no sun in the sky, and I understood that the light by which I perceived these things was from the sun, not the sun." I'm curious if this idea that Jesus is the light of the world is taken as literally by people who speak languages in which sun and sun aren't homonyms, as it is by Spencer and Chad Daybell. Spencer wanders around looking at things. The author stresses several times that there aren't any animals other than fish. I don't know why. Spencer comes upon a stream that feeds into a lake with very clear water. "I stood and put my toe on the water, not in, but on. I felt like I had done this before. I just knew I could. I stepped onto the water and walked out a dozen steps." Again, the author tells us without telling us that Spencer is Jesus's equal. First he was Joseph Smith's equal, and now Spencer is Jesus's equal. Spencer walks across the lake and then walks through the lake and discovers he doesn't need to breathe. He gets out of the lake and realizes he isn't wet because the lake is made of spirit water. And then there's a page-long description of how everything in the meadow is praising God and seeking to do his bidding. The flowers, the lake, the fish, they're all just wallowing in obedience. They had heard the voice of God call to them to assume this shape, and they still listened for his command. Their purpose was as if they were constantly asking, "How can I serve you? How can I be of value to you? This is why I am here." The author specifies that nothing here has agency, and everything only exists to do God's bidding, which sounds great if you're God. Otherwise, it sounds kind of lousy. And am I the only one disturbed by how transactional God's love is in this book? All these flowers asking how they can be of value to God, like he doesn't love them just for existing? I think John Pontius was a pretty good writer, but this chapter does contain one of the worst descriptions I've ever heard, and I have to point it out. "I don't remember seeing animals other than the fish. This place was like a painting where the artist just wanted fish in the lake and chose to paint nothing else." Okay, I honestly don't know what I was supposed to take from that. With a slight adjustment, that could describe any place in the world. The bathroom was like a painting where the artist just wanted a toilet and a sink and chose to paint nothing else. It's a weirdly pointless description. Spencer's angel guide takes him to a big stone building. Spencer remembers watching God create the building and drops the startling revelation that God really loves pillars. Which, I mean, there's nothing wrong with pillars, but I found it so strange that God has architectural preferences. Does he have a favorite color, too? There's a lot of unnecessarily detailed description of the building and each room they walk through and the hallways and the materials from which everything is made. The angel asks Spencer if he knows where they are. He does that a lot. I said with tears of joy streaming down my face, "I'm back home!" In my mind, I thought, this is where I used to live before I was born. I knew I was back in the spirit world, where I grew up as a spirit child. Many sacred memories and scenes flowed through my mind of my spiritual childhood, which I choose not to relate here. Really? We can't hear a single thing he remembers? We can hear about the carvings in the wooden door and the fluted columns holding up the vaulted ceiling and the exact shades of marble in the floors, but not a single memory of being a spirit child? This author's a bit of a tease. The angel shows Spencer his childhood bedroom, although from what I can tell, the entire building belonged to Spencer. And the bedroom is the holodeck from Star Trek: The Next Generation. All that's missing are the black walls with the yellow lines. There's no furniture except a wooden chest, the appearance of which Spencer can alter at will, and the room can produce objects or even create physical environments at his command. Oh, and it's loaded with educational program. It's a holodeck. Spencer opens the chest and examines each item inside, and we don't get to learn about a single one. The author just tells us that they are utensils, tools, and white clothing. Every object in the chest was an achievement of mine. Each object represented an accomplishment, like a trophy of sorts, of a lesson learned, ordinations I had received, stages of development that I had achieved. These objects signified my worthiness and preparation to participate in the object of the lesson, not just in this world, but in the mortal world as well. These things were like certificates, authorizing me to actually do those things. Each ability and authority was gained by a long process of qualifying for and earning that authority. So the chest is the spiritual equivalent of a Boy Scout sash? Saying I spent a lot of time in this room would be incorrect. I spent vast portions of eternity here. I never changed. The room never changed, except as I desired. I never tired, felt hungry, or grew weary of learning. I was enthralled with all of it and did not desire to do anything else unless Father, or some other need, interrupted me. When I had a question, I didn't need to go to Father for the answer. The question formed in my mind, and the room changed to provide the things I needed to learn. My question, after reading Spencer's adventures in the spirit world thus far, is simply, where is everyone? So far, the only person he's seen is the angel who brought him there. There aren't even animals, just fish. None of his recollections seem to involve anyone else. He spent vast portions of eternity alone in his room. The author keeps describing the spirit world as unfathomably wonderful, but how wonderful can isolation really be? The author, perhaps noticing this is a strange and somewhat off-putting description of Spencer's spirit childhood, does begin mentioning the existence of spirit siblings, but not in a flattering way. My education was not random. It was programmed, sequential, and ordained. It was the same sequence of training all of Father's children experienced, though I was aware that not all of Father's children, my siblings, were curious about all things or pursued their education with such devotion and intrigue as some of us did. I see. Spirit child Spencer was a self-important little brown-noser. He reminds me of this kid I knew in orchestra when I was a teenager. We both played the viola, and we were backstage at a concert one time, and he was looking for a place to put his case. I pointed out there was a coffee table he could set it under, which I thought would get it safely out of the way, and he gave me this look and said, "This is a $400 case. I'm not putting it on the floor." He was talented, but he was not a popular member of the orchestra. Maybe that's why Spirit Child Spencer is always alone. So the author writes this about Spencer's less attentive spirit siblings, but several paragraphs later, Spencer suddenly remembers that he had siblings. Apparently they didn't appear in any of the memories he recovered up to this point, or the memory of them he just had. Something is wrong with the timeline. Again, even in the spirit world. As I walked back into the entryway, I suddenly remembered my eternal siblings, mother and father. I did not remember myself as being one of billions. I remembered uncountable siblings, all loved and loving, but I do not remember sharing father and mother with them. I only remember being individually and singularly loved and cherished. This is sort of explained on the next page. I remember father well, his power and majesty, his face, his hands, his form, his touch and tender care. Even today I remember playing with him, running my fingers through the soft hair on his arm, laughing with him, going to divine destinations, sampling future earthly delights, tasting new things, viewing divine events, watching galaxies and eternities flare into being under his hand. To my memory, I was the only one present at these times, though there may have been multitudes of us, each of us feeling individually shepherded through childhood. Most of my spiritual childhood was spent in his tender care, in his arms, in his lap, in his heart. Okay, so time doesn't exist outside of our universe. God can be present in many places simultaneously. It's a little sci-fi, but I can comprehend the idea. What I don't comprehend is why. Why would God create a childhood for spirits that didn't involve community? Why give a child siblings and then keep them apart? Maybe I'm taking the idea of spirit childhood too literally, but it's pretty literal in LDS theology. God has a wife who has his babies. Also, remember that this is Tom Harrison's fantasy. And in his fantasy, none of his spirit siblings matter because he's more devoted to his education than they are. In his fantasy, he has God's undivided attention. He wasn't one of billions. I find this all the more bizarre because Tom Harrison is a child psychologist. After touring the holodeck where Spencer grew up, the angel guides him to walk through a window, which turns out to be a portal to some other places in the spirit world. They exit into a library, and finally we get to meet some other spirit people. A second later, we stepped out into a room filled with people working at desks. Each desk had a large window before it with the same purpose as my room. They were studying the images and objects on the screen. Like my room, they could handle the objects, turn them, touch them, and experience them in every possible way. If the windows at the desks serve the same purpose as Spencer's bedroom, what's the point of this library? Again, there's something strangely isolated about the people. They're each at their individual desks with their personal window portals, but the only people who interact are the instructors who hand out merit badges. Educational tokens, after people learn things. What exactly, we never hear. And I'm not sure why these people are called instructors. They're more like couriers. Suddenly, Spencer is standing at the foot of his bed again, looking at his mortal body. An hour has elapsed. I knew that my body was dead according to the worldly measurement, but I was so thrilled with what I had just experienced that I wanted to wake up my wife and tell her everything I had just learned. Is this man dead or not? The author keeps waffling about whether this is a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience, and it's making me crazy. Commit! It reminds me of a not great movie called Wonder Boys. It's about a novelist played by Michael Douglas who can't finish a book, and the manuscript just keeps getting longer. Finally, he lets one of his students read it. The student is played by Katie Holmes, by the way. So she reads it and she says to him, "You know how you're always telling us that writers have to make choices? Your book kind of feels like you didn't want to make any choices." It's a decent idea in what is otherwise a thoroughly mediocre movie, and I think of it sometimes when I'm stuck. I'm not sure if the author of this book didn't want to make any choices for his characters, or if he was just trying to create ambiguity in case Tom Harrison couldn't keep his story straight later on. Thus ends Chapter 5. That's all for this video, friends. Next time we'll dig into Chapter 6, part of which the author ripped directly off from another NDE memoir, and then we'll finally get into Spencer's vision of the end times. I'm going to start working on that immediately, but I want to let you know that I'm having surgery in July. It's not a dangerous surgery, but there could be kind of a long recovery time, And I know you'll understand if I don't put too much pressure on myself to jump back into working, because you're always really nice to me like that. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking or subscribing. Please don't reach out to anyone involved with this book, and remember to choose your words wisely. Thanks. Hello, and welcome back to WordWise. I'm your host, Kit, and tonight can be right from the start, man. That was published shortly before Dantius. Let's say you're a reporter and you're investigating the validity of your book. You ask Tom Harrison, crap, I said the wrong word there, where I could no longer and that's a lot of S's. What is going on with this weird little gap in my bangs? There we go. Now we're cooking with gas. The vision of hugging Jesus in the church parking lot appears to be references in Dana, while possessed by Zul's... Wait, is she the keymaster or the gatekeeper? Crap. To be hovering over top of Tom Harrison. It looks... Oh wait, I'm supposed to read that. Unrealistic, except... refers to the Melchizedek priesthood. Shit, is it Kizedek or Kezedek? My hand passed through digital there. At least through official channels. What is on my face? Oh my god. Spencer has had out-of-body... that was an intense itch. Did something sting me? Will they ever listen to and trust? The tip is the business end of the key. End result of sacrificed and priesthood. Did I say sacrificed? It's the business end. Right. While Spencer and Angel... An angel? Are we calling him Angel now? And if you receive the fullness of the priesthood, you'll be translated. Was when Moses and Eliza? Yeah, Moses and Eliza appeared. Speak languages in which son and son aren't homonyms. Did I say homonyms? Can I not say that word? Homonyms. How everything in the meadow is praising God and seeking to do his business. His business. What are you doing here? I'm on God's business. Angry cat sound. Can you hear my neighbor's dog bark? Spencer's angel takes him to a long stone building. A long stone? No, it's a big stone building. So obviously, oh my god, I'm never going to be able to speak again. That's it. That's the end. See, I'm already having fun.